It was the kind of moment that makes you stop scrolling and lean in closer to the screen. You know the feeling. When the tension is so thick, you can almost taste it. Big Shaq, the larger-than-life personality who took the internet by storm, with his viral bars and unshakable confidence, was sitting across from a liberal reporter who had clearly come with an agenda. The reporter, known for his sharp tongue and no-holds-barred approach, had been building a reputation for taking down public figures with his pointed questions. But this time, he wasn't just going after anyone. He was going after Big Shaq. And what happened next? Well, let's just say it wasn't what anyone expected. The stage was set in a small, dimly lit studio. Cameras were rolling, the audience was buzzing, and the air was electric with anticipation. Big Shaq, ever the showman, walked in with his trademark swagger, flashing that million-dollar grin. He was relaxed, cracking jokes with the crew, as if he didn't have a care in the world. But the reporter? He was all business. Dressed in a crisp suit, his notes neatly organized, he had that look in his eye, the kind that says, "I'm here to make a point." From the moment the interview started, it was clear this wasn't going to be your typical back and forth. The reporter came out swinging, his questions dripping with skepticism and a hint of condescension. He challenged Shaq on everything: his music, his persona, even his influence on pop culture. It was as if he was trying to peel back the layers of the man behind the meme, to expose something, anything. But here's the thing about Big Shaq. He's not just a character. He's sharp, quick-witted, and knows exactly how to handle himself under pressure. As the reporter fired off question after question, Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into it, turning the tables in ways no one saw coming. His responses were a mix of humor, intelligence, and raw authenticity that left the reporter visibly thrown off balance. The audience was eating it up, cheering and laughing as Shaq dismantled every argument with ease. But just when it seemed like Shaq had the upper hand, the reporter dropped a bombshell. A question so personal, so unexpected, that even Shaq paused for a moment. The room went silent. The tension was palpable. And then, well, that's where things get interesting. What happened next? Did Shaq rise to the occasion and deliver the mic drop moment of the century? Or did the reporter finally find a crack in the armor of the internet's favorite personality? The truth is, this wasn't just an interview. It was a battle of wits, a clash of ideologies, and a moment that would leave everyone talking. But to find out how it all went down, you'll have to keep watching. Because trust me, this story is far from over. The silence in the studio was deafening. Big Shaq, usually so quick with a comeback, sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The reporter leaned forward, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if he knew he'd finally struck a nerve. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. The audience held their breath, waiting for Shaq's response. But instead of answering, Shaq did something no one expected. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a forced one, but a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to echo through the room. The reporter's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he regained his composure. "Care to share what's so funny?" he asked, his tone sharp but tinged with curiosity. Shaq wiped a tear from his eye, still chuckling. "You," he said, pointing at the reporter. "You really thought you had me there, didn't you?" The audience erupted in laughter, but the reporter wasn't amused. He pressed on, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't a joke, Shaq. People want to know the real you. They want to know if you're just a character, or if there's something more behind the persona." Shaq's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. Something raw, something real. "You want the real me?" he said, his voice steady but softer now. "All right, let's talk." And just like that, the tone of the interview shifted. What had started as a fiery clash of egos was now something far more intimate. Shaq began to open up, sharing stories from his past that few had ever heard. He talked about growing up in a tough neighborhood, where dreams often got buried under the weight of reality. He spoke about the struggles of chasing a career in music, the countless rejections, and the moments when he almost gave up. But he also talked about the people who believed in him, the ones who pushed him to keep going, even when the odds seemed impossible. The audience was captivated, hanging on every word. Even the reporter seemed to soften, his earlier aggression replaced by a quiet attentiveness. But just as Shaq was starting to let his guard down, the reporter interrupted. "That's all very touching," he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "But let's not forget why we're here. You've built this massive following, this empire, on a character. People love Big Shaq, but do they really know you? Or are you just giving them what they want to see?" Shaq paused, his jaw tightening. It was a fair question, but one that clearly hit a nerve. "You think this is all an act?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "You think I'm just playing a role?" The reporter shrugged. "I'm just saying it's easy to hide behind a persona. What's harder is showing the world who you really are." The tension in the room was back, thicker than ever. Shaq leaned forward, his eyes locked on the reporter's. "You want to know who I really am?" he said, his voice steady but with an edge that sent a chill through the room. "I'll tell you, but be careful what you wish for." The audience gasped, the energy in the studio shifting once again. The reporter, to his credit, didn't back down. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm but challenging. "Enlighten us." What followed was a revelation no one saw coming. Shaq began to peel back the layers of his life, sharing stories that were equal parts inspiring and heartbreaking. He talked about the sacrifices he'd made, the people he'd lost along the way, and the moments of doubt that still haunted him. He spoke about the pressure of living up to the persona he'd created, the fear of being exposed as a fraud, and the constant battle to stay true to himself in a world that wanted him to be everything but. It was raw, it was real, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever heard from him before. But just as Shaq was about to reveal something even more personal, something that seemed to weigh heavily on him, the reporter cut him off. "This is all very moving," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But let's not forget the bigger picture. You're a public figure, Shaq. You have influence. And with that influence comes responsibility. So, I have to ask, what are you doing with it? Are you using your platform to make a difference? Or are you just here for the fame and the clout?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Shaq sat back, his expression a mix of anger and frustration. "You think I don't care?" he said, his voice rising. "You think this is all just a game to me?" The reporter shrugged. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to." Shaq shook his head, his fists clenched. "You don't get it," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You don't get what it's like to be in my shoes. You don't know what I've been through, what I've had to do to get here. So don't sit there and act like you know me." The room was silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The audience was on the edge of their seats, unsure of what would happen next. The reporter, sensing he'd struck a nerve, pressed on. "Then help me understand," he said, his voice softer now but still probing. "Help us understand. Because right now, all we see is Big Shaq, the character, the persona. But who are you when the cameras are off? Who are you when no one's watching?" Shaq stared at him for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He looked like he was about to say something, to finally let the world in on the secret he'd been guarding so closely. But then, just as he opened his mouth, the producer's voice cut through the silence. "We're out of time," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "We'll have to pick this up in the next segment." The audience groaned in disappointment, but the tension in the room didn't ease. Shaq stood up, his expression unreadable, and walked off the set without another word. The reporter watched him go, a mix of frustration and curiosity on his face. He'd come here to expose Big Shaq, to peel back the layers and reveal the man behind the meme. But what he'd uncovered was something far more complex, far more human than he'd ever expected. And as the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, one thing was clear. This story was far from over. What would happen in the next segment? Would Shaq finally reveal the truth about who he really was? Or would he retreat back into the safety of his persona, leaving the world to wonder? The reporter didn't know, but one thing was certain. He wasn't done asking questions. And Shaq? Well, he wasn't done answering them. But what those answers would be, and where they would lead, was anyone's guess. The stage was set, the stakes were high, and the world was watching. And as the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and unresolved. Who was the real Big Shaq?